Hi, this is the video lecture on racial inequality. So I want to start off talking about the way that sociologists view race. So first and foremost, you need to know that, as with many things, we view race as socially constructed. Now, what I'm talking about here is the idea that racial classifications and the people that we put into them are defined by society, not biology. And there are a couple of points to consider when thinking about why this is. So first, racial classifications vary across cultures. In America, we have historically had two dominant racial groups, white and black, and there are other racial groups to consider here: Asian and Native American. Latinos sometimes are, but sometimes aren't considered a race. But generally speaking, the American racial classification system is fairly rigid. But in Brazil, for example, the racial classification system is much more fluid. Race is viewed as much more of a gradation based on skin color, variations in the pigment of skin, so much so that even siblings within the same family will hold different racial classifications based on their differences in skin color. So if race and racial classifications were biological, we would expect to see much more consistency between cultures. We also know that race can vary historically within any single culture. So, for example, early 20th century Italian, German, Jewish, and Polish immigrants were actually classified as non-white, or at the very least, they weren't incorporated fully within those boundaries of whiteness, but their descendants very much are today. Now, it can be difficult to wrap our minds around this idea that race is social rather than biological, and that's largely because we can see race, right? We make classifications based on physical appearance, which obviously has something to do with biology. The key here is to distinguish between phenotype and genetic differences. So, phenotype refers to our appearances, what we see on the surface, and these superficial markers serve as the foundation for racial classification. So in the US, we base race on skin color, eye shape, hair texture, and we use these things to classify individuals into different racial categories, but we could just as easily use other aspects of our physical appearances, such as eye color, finger length, height, because when it comes right down to it, there's actually very little genetic variation between humans. In fact, there's 10 times more genetic variation between any two fruit flies than there is between any two humans. Now, the genetic variation that does exist cannot be mapped along genetic lines. So what this means is that a white woman is just as likely to have similar DNA to a black man as she would another white woman or a white man. Now, I'm going to post a short clip in the Unit 3 folder that reinforces some of the ideas that I just spoke about and can help us understand some of the seemingly biological differences we see between racial groups that sociologists view as socially constructed. Now, the point leaves off on an important point, and it's the idea that while race is socially constructed, it has profound social consequences. We take these superficial physical differences and then somehow use them to signify other differences between racial groups, differences in temperament, sexuality, intelligence, athletic ability, and on and on. We use these visible cues as the basis for racial stereotypes. Now, as a result of this classification and its importance in our lives, it influences a variety of outcomes. So race is important when we consider access to material resources such as income, wealth, and education. And it's also important to access to non-material resources such as political and cultural representation. The mainstream or hegemonic explanation for variations between racial groups centers on themes of color blindness and cultural deficiency. So this is the idea that the U.S. is a post-racial society. So for many in the U.S., the majority of people, and especially whites, they tend to think that racial inequality is a thing of the past, that we live in a post-racial society where race no longer matters in American life. So any differences we see between racial groups in things like income, education, incarceration rates, political representation, any differences we see are as a result of those own groups doing. Going along with this hegemonic ideology is this idea that cultural deficiencies are to blame when thinking about racial inequality. So this is the idea that certain racial groups do not hold the right types of values to succeed in American life. And I hope that when I say that certain racial groups don't hold the right types of value to succeed in American life, you think back to what we learned when we discussed culture towards the beginning of the semester, and more specifically how culture works to reinforce the dominance and power of certain groups. So the idea here is that because these groups don't value the things that they should, then they don't achieve as much as racial groups who do have the right values. Now, please remember that mainstream explanations, those that are more hegemonic in nature, those tend to be in stark contrast to more sociological explanations. And so the handout, one of the handouts assigned with Unit 3, the Racial Inequality handout, lists several sociological explanations for the racial inequality that we see. All of them work to take into account the structure of society. So I'll run through the list very quickly, but make sure that you understand them. I think the reading is pretty clear. So sociologists would point to things such as racially homogeneous networks, the wealth gap, racial residential segregation, structural racism, and colorblind racism and achievement ideologies. Now, one last thing that I want to talk about in this video lecture is the distinction sociologists make between prejudice and racism. So in mainstream society, these two terms are often used interchangeably, but to a sociologist, there's a big difference between the two. So according to Tatum, one of the readings assigned in this topic, prejudice involves a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information. And what she suggests is that prejudice is as a result of the society that we live in. And she says that we all have them, that we all internalize these prejudices, and that they operate on more of an unconscious level. We're not always acutely aware that we're being affected by them, but nonetheless we generally are. Excuse me. So we can contrast prejudice with racism. Racism is defined as a system of advantage based on race. So rather than just being a belief, racism is more than that. It's about the structure of society. So this means that racism is not merely personal ideology, but a system involving cultural messages and institutional politics and practices, as well as beliefs of individuals. And again, you can see how this is very different than kind of the mainstream definition of racism. Now, sociologists generally think that all whites benefit from a racist society, but not equally. And it's important to emphasize the fact that this is a system of advantage bestowed upon whites in the U.S. without their consent. I often like to say to students, I identify as a white middle-class woman, and as such, I recognize that I am afforded privilege in certain ways. And so I like to tell students that if I were to walk outside my front door and say to the world, I no longer want to be the recipient of the white privilege that the structure of our society affords me, what would happen? Probably not a lot, because that privilege that I receive due to the color of my skin, due to my racial classification, is more about the structure of this society rather than anything that I'm going out there and seeking out for myself. Nonetheless, once I recognize that I have this privilege and recognize what it has to do with the structure of our society and my social location within it, it's from a sociological perspective and from a critical sociological perspective, I would argue that it's important that we do things to try to undermine that whenever that opportunity presents itself. Now, one last thing. This definition of racism also implies that persons of color cannot be racist because they do not benefit from the systematic advantaging related to racism. Now, this is not to suggest that prejudice or that persons of color can be prejudiced against other persons of color or against whites. And I'm not going to say, and I'm not meaning to suggest that this prejudice is good or okay by any means. It's problematic in and of itself, but what it does suggest is that there are different consequences associated with prejudice and racism, and hopefully you can think about that through the lens of false parallels that we learned about earlier in this unit. Okay, that's all that I have in terms of racial inequality. I hope you have a great day. Let me know if I can provide any clarification. Thanks.